Imagine you are sitting on your couch in the US, scrolling through your phone after work. A video pops up. It is slick, emotional, beautifully shot. The music rises gently. You see images of families, children, doctors, teachers, workers. There is a calm, trustworthy voice explaining how a new digital currency backed by gold will bring stability, fairness, and opportunity to people around the world. It sounds serious. It sounds responsible. It sounds safe. It is presented like an educational segment, almost like a public service announcement. No loud memes, no chaos, no conspiracy tone. Just a clean, professional, here is the future of money story. If you are a normal viewer, not obsessed with geopolitics or finance, you probably feel something like, that actually sounds kind of reasonable. You may not know exactly what BRICS is or what it means to launch a gold-backed currency, but the ad is doing its job. It is framing the conversation for you before you even realize there is a conversation to be had. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward message. The world is changing, and we are offering a more stable, fair system. That is layer one. That is the calm surface of the water. But what happens if you do not stop at the surface? What if you treat this ad not as a piece of information, but as a move in a long, complicated game? Start with the most obvious layer, the surface story being told to ordinary people. The ad wants you to believe three simple things. First, that the current dollar-based system is unstable and unfair to many countries. Second, that a new, gold-backed currency created by a coalition of rising economies will fix that unfairness. And third, that this is a rational, technocratic response to economic reality, not a political weapon. The tone is calm for a reason. There is no "down with America" language, no angry slogans, no flags waving in slow motion. The message is, this is just math, just economics. We are simply modernizing the global system. That is how you talk when you want to sound like the adult in the room. That is how you talk when your real audience is not activists or radical fans, but skeptical professionals, policymakers, and investors who hate drama but pay attention to signals of stability. The production style matters too. Good lighting, international, diverse faces, clean infographics, trustworthy narration. All of this is designed to bypass the defenses that would activate if the message felt too ideological. If you are an average American viewer, you may not even feel attacked. You are told that people in the global south deserve fairness, that gold is stable, that trade should be balanced. How do you argue with any of that without sounding cruel or ignorant? The first success of the ad is not to convince you that the new system is better. The first success is to make it emotionally and morally awkward for you to defend the old system. Now look at the timing and targeting. This type of ad does not exist in a vacuum. It appears in a moment when inflation, debt, and political polarization in the US are constantly in the news. You hear debates about the debt ceiling, about trillion-dollar deficits, about whether the Federal Reserve is trapped. You see headlines about weaponized sanctions, about countries exploring alternatives to the dollar. In that atmosphere, an ad like this lands on fertile soil. It quietly connects itself to concerns you already have. It is not shouting, "The American empire is collapsing." It is whispering, "You already feel something is off. Here is a responsible solution." That is psychological judo. Instead of pushing against your existing anxiety, it flows with it. Instead of trying to persuade you with raw ideology, it uses your own unease as the engine of its narrative. From the surface, if you are not paying attention, it just looks like a well-made, slightly abstract piece about global finance. But if you zoom out, if you look at who produced it, when it was pushed, who it is trying to reassure and who it is trying to unsettle, the surface becomes a map. And that map points downwards toward the deeper layers that are not meant for everyone. Now drop below the surface. Behind that calm voice and glossy footage, there is a very specific set of conversations happening in private rooms. These conversations do not sound like, "We want fairness for everyone." They sound like, "How do we reduce our exposure to US sanctions? How do we avoid having our reserves frozen if Washington decides to punish us? How do we gain leverage in trade negotiations with the White House?" In other words, the behind-the-scenes layer is not about feelings, it is about power. Think of all the finance ministers, central bank officials, and presidential advisors who have watched the last decade unfold. They saw reserves seized, they saw banks cut out of payment systems, they saw contracts renegotiated under pressure. Whether you believe these actions were justified or not, they all delivered the same message to non-US governments. If you cross Washington, your money is vulnerable. Now imagine you are one of those advisors. You know your country is stuck in a dollar-centric system. You know your exports are priced in dollars, your reserves are held in US assets, your banks rely on US-dominated pipes. At the same time, you also know that publicly attacking the United States directly always creates blowback. Investors get nervous. Ratings agencies start to whisper. Diplomatic doors close. So what do? You do what this ad does. You reframe your exit plan as a technical upgrade. In closed-door meetings, the language is far more blunt. If we can settle more trade in a new unit, we reduce our vulnerability to secondary sanctions. If we can price some commodities in an alternative benchmark, we weaken the dollar's monopoly over global pricing power. If we can get a few major exporters and importers to sign on, we can create facts on the ground that Washington cannot easily reverse. Notice the difference in tone. Publicly, we are modernizing for global fairness. Privately, we are building an insurance policy against American pressure. That gap between the front stage script and the backstage strategy is not accidental. It is the strategy. You are watching a classic two-level game. On one level, leaders speak to their domestic and international publics with the language of stability, rules, and cooperation. On another level, they speak to each other with the language of bargaining, leverage, and survival. The ad is a bridge between those two worlds. It is polished enough for the public, but coded enough for insiders to recognize as a signal. We are serious. We are moving. We are not just complaining about the system, we are designing a new one. Listen very carefully to what is not said in the ad. There is no explicit promise that this new currency will replace the dollar overnight. There is no claim that the US is about to collapse. There is no direct attack on American consumers or workers. Instead, the focus is on themes like multipolarity, diversification, and resilience. That choice of words is deliberate. It sounds harmless, almost boring. But in the language of central bankers and strategic planners, those words carry weight. Diversification means we are going to hold fewer of your assets and more of our own. Resilience means we want to be able to keep trading and growing even if you punish us. Multipolarity means we reject the idea that you are the only center of gravity. Every time these words are repeated in a serious, sober tone, they chip away, just a little, at the story Americans have been told for decades, that the dollar system, for all its flaws, is the only truly safe and neutral option. Think of how this plays with US allies, European policymakers, Japanese officials, Korean strategists, Gulf states, emerging economies in Africa and Latin America. They all have to read this ad as a political text. On the record, they might shrug it off as a propaganda effort or a fantasy. Off the record, many of them will ask the same hard question. What if this is the early stage of a slow, long-term shift that we cannot ignore? They have watched energy supplies being leveraged, tech exports used as negotiating tools, and critical supply chains turned into pressure points. They have seen how quickly rules can change when security interests clash with economic logic. For them, the behind-the-scenes function of this ad is to normalize the idea that there will soon be more than one serious financial center of gravity. Even if they do not join immediately, the seed is planted. The Overton window of what is thinkable has been nudged. Before, talking about a parallel gold-linked settlement unit might have sounded fringe. After enough repetition, it starts to sound like one scenario among several that responsible governments should at least plan for. This is where it becomes interesting for a US audience. At first glance, you might say, so what? The dollar is still used in most global trade, US bonds are still the deepest and most liquid market, and every time there is a crisis, money rushes into US assets. All of that is true, for now, but money does not move only based on what is true today. It also moves based on expectations about tomorrow, and expectations are shaped by stories. This ad is not trying to rewrite the balance sheet overnight. It is trying to rewrite the story in people's heads about what could happen over the next 10 or 20 years. Every time a business leader, a finance minister, or a wealthy family office watches content like this and thinks, maybe I should diversify a bit, a microscopic shift happens. They do not have to dump dollars. They just need to increase the share of something else. Over time, small, quiet reallocations can add up to large structural changes. To see how this fits into a bigger balancing act, imagine 3 kinds of audiences watching the same piece of content. Audience 1 is the global public, regular people, small business owners, professionals, students. For them, the goal is emotional framing. Make them feel that the current system is unfair and fragile, and that a new system can be fair and stable. Audience 2 is elites in other countries, including US allies. For them, the goal is plausibility. Make the idea of a new settlement unit sound technically and politically realistic enough that they cannot dismiss it as fantasy. Audience 3 is the United States itself, policymakers, think tank analysts, investors. For them, the goal is pressure. Not immediate panic, but a low, constant background hum of, what if we are not as untouchable as we think? The genius of this kind of messaging is that it speaks in one voice, but delivers different payloads to each audience. You hear one sentence, they hear 3 separate meanings depending on where they sit. Now step down to the strategic core, the deep layer that almost never appears in public messages, but drives them from underneath. This layer is not about economics alone. It is about what kind of world order will exist when your children are adults. For the countries pushing this new model, the strategic core question is simple. How do we reduce the United States' ability to decide unilaterally what is allowed and what is forbidden in the global economy? For the United States, the core question is equally simple and far more uncomfortable. How do we stay the central node in the system without pushing others so hard that they spend decades quietly building alternatives? Notice something important here. This is not a morality play in which one side is pure and the other is evil. This is a structural clash between a dominant power that uses its position to enforce rules and rising or dissatisfied powers that feel those rules are sometimes applied selectively or weaponized against them. The BRICS gold-linked narrative is one way of saying, we do not accept that your domestic political battles and your foreign policy priorities should automatically define the financial weather for the rest of the planet. There is also a domestic strategic core inside each of these countries. For political leaders at home, proposing an ambitious, almost grandiose economic project has several benefits. It signals strength and vision to their own citizens. It provides a long-term narrative that can outlive short-term problems. It offers a kind of insurance. Even if growth slows or domestic frustrations rise, leaders can point to a bigger mission. We are changing the world's financial architecture. To rally support. This is why you see these projects framed as historic turning points. The language is often dramatic. The end of an era, a new chapter, a multipolar future. Even if the technical reality for the next few years is far more modest, perhaps a limited settlement instrument used only in specific trades, the story remains large. The story is what keeps domestic elites invested and reduces the risk that the whole thing is abandoned after 1 or 2 setbacks. From a US perspective, Facing this strategic core honestly requires dropping some comfortable illusions. For decades, Americans have been told that the dollar's dominance is simply the natural result of a free, open, innovative economy. There is truth in that, but it is only part of the truth. The other part is that dominance has also been maintained through very hard power, control over critical financial infrastructure, the credibility of US military protection for key trade routes, the ability to enforce sanctions quickly and at scale. When that hard power is used lightly and sparingly, it feels like background architecture. When it is used often and visibly, it starts to look like a tool of coercion. The more it looks like coercion, the more energy other actors are willing to invest in building parallel systems, even if those systems are less efficient at first. That is the paradox. The more aggressively you use your central position, the more you motivate others to spend years eroding it. This is where the ad, and others like it, become a quiet feedback loop. They are not only a symptom of geopolitical change, they are also an input into that change. They help transform elite frustration into popular narrative. They take something that was once only discussed at conferences and turn it into an image, a feeling, a sense of direction. And they do it in a way that is hard to respond to directly. If the US government were to release a counter-ad saying, "The dollar is good, alternatives are bad," it would immediately sound defensive, almost insecure. That is why so far Washington tends to respond through statements, policy papers, and technical arguments about liquidity and trust. Those arguments matter, but they are not reaching the same emotional ground that these carefully produced narratives are occupying. So what does all of this mean for an American viewer listening to this as a voiceover? It means you are not just hearing about some distant financial experiment. You are being invited, without anyone saying it out loud, into a struggle over who gets to define normal in the global economy. For your entire life, normal has meant a world where crises drive capital into US assets, where oil is priced in dollars, where the ultimate safe place to store wealth is US treasuries. The BRICS-style narrative is pushing a different normal, a world where there is no single safe harbor, only competing havens, no single reserve currency, only a basket, no single enforcer of rules, only shifting coalitions. That kind of world would feel very different in daily life. Interest rates, exchange rates, and import prices could become more volatile. US policymakers would have less room to run enormous deficits without market pushback. Sanctions would still exist, but their bite could be weaker. American consumers might pay a hidden tax in the form of higher borrowing costs and more expensive imports as some of the exorbitant privilege of issuing the dominant currency erodes. But here is the crucial point. None of this is inevitable. The ad you saw at the beginning of this story is not a prophecy. It is a proposal. It is a negotiating move. It is an opening bid in a long, complex process of recalibration. The United States still has immense advantages: a deep and innovative economy, strong institutions relative to most of the world, unmatched military reach, and a financial system that, for all its flaws, is still more transparent and predictable than most alternatives. The question is not whether a single video or even a coordinated media campaign can topple that. It cannot. The question is whether American leaders and citizens are willing to hear the signal inside the noise. The signal is this: a significant share of the world is actively exploring ways to reduce its dependency on US financial power. They are doing it slowly, carefully, often clumsily. They are not always aligned with each other. They face internal contradictions and technical challenges, but they are moving. And as they move, they are telling a story to themselves and to their people about why they are moving. That story casts the United States not as a neutral referee, but as a powerful player whose interests do not always match everyone else's. If Americans continue to act as if that story does not exist, they will keep being surprised by decisions that, from their point of view, seem irrational. Why would a country choose a less efficient alternative to the dollar system? Why would it accept higher short-term costs just to launch a new payment rail or diversify reserves? From inside that country's story, the answer is obvious: because dependence feels more dangerous than inefficiency. So pause here. Take a breath. Let this sink in. You are not being asked to root for one side. You are being asked to look at the layers. The surface layer, calm, polished messaging about a better financial future. The behind-the-scenes layer, tough, unsentimental calculations about leverage, vulnerability, and bargaining power. The strategic core, a long-term struggle over whose rules, whose risks, and whose narratives will shape the next few decades. Once you see those layers, you cannot unsee them. The next time you watch a geopolitical ad, a central bank announcement, or a vision speech about the future of money, you will notice the gaps between what is said and what is unsaid. You will hear when a word like stability is actually a code for control, when reform is a code for escape, when cooperation is a code for we cannot do this alone. For a US audience, that awareness is not a luxury. It is a form of self-defense. If you assume that the rest of the world will always accept the current arrangement, because it has worked for you, you will misread almost every signal coming your way. But if you understand that other players are building narratives to support slow, methodical shifts away from your central position, you gain something very valuable. Time. Time to adjust policies before they backfire. Time to invest in real competitiveness instead of taking the dollar's role for granted. Time to decide, consciously, what kind of leadership you want to offer in a world that no longer feels obliged to orbit only one financial sun. In the end, that original ad is less important than the questions it forces you to ask. Not, will this gold-backed project succeed exactly as advertised? But what does it reveal about how others see us? Not, is the dollar doomed tomorrow? But how much pressure can we apply through our financial power before others quietly decide they have had enough? Not, are they bluffing? But why were they willing to invest political capital and storytelling resources in this direction at all? Those are uncomfortable questions. They cut through slogans. They demand honesty from both sides of the screen, from the people producing the message and from the people hearing it. And that, maybe, is the most unsettling layer of all. Because once you start asking those questions, you realize something. The future of the global financial system is not just about what they do. It is about how clearly we are willing to see ourselves. That is where this story leaves you. Not with a neat, comforting answer, but with a sharper lens. A lens you can carry into every future headline about de-dollarization, every viral clip about new world orders, every statement from a finance ministry half a world away. The ad wanted you to feel that the future is already decided. The truth is more complicated and more human. The future is being negotiated, layer by layer, narrative by narrative, decision by decision. The question is not only who writes the rules, it is also who writes the script you choose to believe.